So he turned Islam, or he gave Islam an ideological formulation, which, if you look at the period of time that he was working, in 1917, the communists, after a period of 60 or 80 years of agitation and organization, Marxists took power in Russia, and they transformed the society in line with an ideological vision of life. And personally, I think that although the Maududi's world vision is primarily derived from the Qur'an, that people are the product of their environments, and that on some level, the movement that he formed was designed to respond to the challenge of the communists by incorporating a lot of the elements of their approach to organization and goals. And so he set up what was sort of an Islamic counterpart of left-wing social movements. And now, Hassan al-Banna had long before the foundation of Jamaat Islami, he had founded the Ikhwan al-Muslimun. He was assassinated in, I believe, 1949. And what's really interesting to me is that around that same time, Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi began translating Maududi's works into Arabic. And so Sayyid Qutb, who joined the Ikhwan al-Muslimun probably around 1950, 1951, he started reading Maududi in Arabic. And so Sayyid Qutb never personally, maybe he met Hassan al-Banna, but he wasn't a member of the Ikhwan al-Muslimun until after Hassan al-Banna was dead. And Sayyid Qutb was significantly influenced by Maududi in his understanding of Islam's place in the modern world. And so, Fi Dhilal al-Qur'an is probably the most influential tafsir among Arabic-speaking educated people in the 20th century. And it was heavily influenced by Tafhim al-Qur'an, or by Maududi's outlook in general, if not directly by his tafsir, which may not have been translated. And probably wasn't. According to Khurshid Ahmed, who is one of the leaders of the Islamic Foundation, which is based in England, Tafhim al-Qur'an was the most widely read tafsir in the world in the modern era. I can't comment on that one way or another, but that's a claim. And the intended audience of Tafhim al-Qur'an was Indian Muslims who were educated, but they didn't have any kind of an Arabic background per se, or any formal initiation or background in Islamic sciences. So the educated layman. And one of the phenomenon that I recall from coming up in America as a Muslim in the 70s, I accepted Islam as a 22-year-old, seeing these tafsir circles, sometimes you see it where it's basically Arab doctors and engineers, and sometimes it would be Indian Pakistani doctors and engineers. And so they would sit together and read TAFSIIR, or somebody among them would make TAFSIIR. If they were from an Indian Pakistani background, then more likely than not, the TAFSIIR they would be relying upon would be Tafhim al-Qur'an. And Maududi wrote a preface to Tafhim al-Qur'an in which he discussed the nature of the Qur'an, its fundamental claims, its objective, and the means by which that objective would be realized. Its subject is humankind's ultimate success and failure. The central thesis is that humans need to take the right attitude in life, that is, to accept Allah's sovereignty in all spheres of life and submit to Him in practice. And its goal is to invite man to adopt that right attitude. And that if you don't understand that the Qur'an is a handbook for movement, you'll never be able to approach it or grasp its spirit. He says, as soon as this book was revealed, it drove a quiet, kind-hearted man from his isolation and seclusion and placed him upon the battlefield of life to challenge a world that had gone astray. And he says that when you approach the Qur'an, a reader should approach the Qur'an by first getting rid of your preconceptions. And then said if you have preconceptions, then you're going to impose them upon the Qur'an. Try to empty yourself of preconceptions. Read the Qur'an. He said, read it from cover to cover once or twice. Twice, it should be twice at least, before you actually start trying to study it. And then read it again and make notes of questions, things that bother you, things that, why is that? And he said, when you, as you keep reading, you'll probably find the answer right there in the Qur'an to your question. And, you make note of the answer along with your question. And then in a separate little preface, he talks about his approach to translation, because he did translate the Qur'an into Urdu along with the commentary. And he said, well, there are already closely literal translations of Qur'an into Urdu. And he said, and I chose not to do that because when you break them up into separate ayahs, then you lose the flow. So he would present the text as sections, paragraphs and sections. And he said that he took a more loose approach to translation in order to try to catch some of the vividness, to preserve the vividness of the language in a presentation. And he suggested that a reader should, read whatever portion of the Qur'an he would read daily, read it in Arabic, then read a literal translation, then read his more fluid translation, and then read his notes. And then regarding the translations, the first is by CH, which I guess stands for Chaudhry, Muhammad Akbar. It was published by Islamic Publications, which is a Jamaat Islami, I believe, publishing house in Lahore, 1973. The second was by Zafar Ishaq Ansari, who was suggested to Maududi, and he approved him. That was first published by the Islamic Foundation in England starting in 1988. They would put out a volume every year or two. By now they must have completed it, I'm not sure. There were just 2 or 3 volumes present in the UAE library when I went to look at it. Let me just read a little portion of his Tafsir of Surah Yusuf. I found his approach to Surah Yusuf very interesting. He sets it in first its context of why it was revealed and what implications that had. Somebody asked him a question about it as a sort of a challenge, and they thought that they could stump him, and then the whole thing was revealed right there. They asked him about the story of Yusuf. The whole surah was revealed at once, and that the parallels between the story of Yusuf and the situation of the Muslims in Mecca and the Prophet ﷺ in particular, there were all these strong parallels. That there were all these people who had tried to arrange matters so that they would achieve their own individual selfish goals. And Allah had a plan, and here was a person who was Muhsin, Yusuf, and Allah made all these arrangements that through all of these trials which elevated his stature and refined his personality and hardened his sterling qualities, so to speak, made them more concrete and firm, that through this whole process, Allah showed how He's in control of all affairs, and that there's all these parallels between that and the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, such that it's a kind of a warning to the Quraysh that, just like Yusuf's brothers, they tried to do all these bad things to him, and in the end, he came out on top, and he ended up forgiving them. And they had to actually hope that he would forgive them. And then, so the Quraysh, who are the relatives of the Prophet ﷺ, they're putting him through all this similar treatment. And if you don't change your ways, you're going to be in the same position as Yusuf's brothers. And in fact, that's what happened. That when the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca, he said, "What do you think I should do with you?" And they said, "You're the akhun kareem wabnu akhin kareem. You're a generous brother and the son of a generous brother." And he said, "Well, I'll say to you what Yusuf said. La tathriba alaykum al-yawm. There's no blame upon you today. Go, you're all free." So that was, he sets that context within the seerah, relationship between the surah and the seerah, and then he sets a connotation, or he sets a historical context of when this event occurred, and he compares the Quranic versions throughout the story with the version that appear in the Old Testament, also the version that appears in the Talmud, pointing out the superiority of the Quranic version. He doesn't make any attempt to be, this is like this, and they're all literature. No, the Quran is untampered revelation. The rest of this is human hands have been at work upon it, and it shows the inferiority that results from that is blatant. Let me just refer to one section here, which is the whole issue of Yusuf. He's come out of prison and he's interpreted the king's dream, and the king wants some kind of plan to be drawn up to deal with this situation, and Yusuf volunteers. And so, this poses some kind of a problem for Maududi, because here is a man who's not only a pious Muslim, but he's a prophet of Allah, and he's applying to work in a non-Islamic government. So, and then, so he deals with that, and then he also deals with the whole situation of how Yusuf, he couldn't have taken Binyamin, he couldn't have held him back according to Din al-Malik, the legal system, not just the legal system, but the whole way of life of the king. He couldn't have held him back according to the Din al-Malik unless Allah made arrangements for him. And so he goes into a lengthy explanation of what does this imply? how could a prophet of Allah administer and not, be a functionary in a government that's set up without any recognition of Allah's law. And we don't have time to go into it, but I recommend that you read it and can make your draw your own conclusions about how successful he is in presenting his arguments.